Next up, to introduce our next speaker, I'm going to call on the head of the journalism department in the School of Journalism and New Media, Dr. Bill Cassidy.
Good morning. Let me get situated here. Thanks. Brian Stelter is our first speaker. Brian Stelter is the chief media analyst for CNN Worldwide and the lead author of the Reliable Sources newsletter. From 2013 to 2022, he was the anchor of CNN's Sunday morning media analysis program, Reliable Sources. Mr. Stelter is a best-selling author of 3 books, the most recent of which is Network of Lies, an examination of Dominion Voting System's historic defamation case against Fox News. He is also the author of Hoax, Donald Trump, Fox News, and the Dangerous Distortion of Truth. The book tells the story of the complex relationship between President Trump and Fox News. Over the course of writing the book, he spoke with more than 250 former and current Fox News insiders in an effort to understand the inner workings of the network. Mr. Stelter's first book, Top of the Morning, Inside the Cutthroat World of Morning TV, was a New York Times bestseller and inspired the popular Apple TV program The Morning Show, for which he serves as a producer. He is a former New York Times reporter, a recipient of the Walter Cronkite Award for Excellence in Television Political Journalism, and a 2-time winner of the Bart Richards Award for Media Criticism. And I think given that we're on a college campus, it's important to highlight that he serves on the board of Baltimore Student Media, a nonprofit organization that publishes the independent student newspaper of his alma mater, Towson University. Please join me in welcoming Brian Stelter.
Hey, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to try out this Zoom thing and make sure it's working. Give me a thumbs up if you're able to hear me. You know, you have all these influencers these days who use those really tiny microphones. So I'm trying the opposite. I'm trying to resist that. I'm trying the super extra large microphone to make sure this is coming through okay. But I wanted to start by apologizing for not being able to be there in person. I was so excited to come to Oxford. I had my tickets booked. I was going to fly down to Memphis and get the car and make a 3-day trip out of it all. But family matters kept me here in New Jersey, unfortunately. So I'm stuck here with my red CNN bookshelf. So I apologize. I can't see you all in person, but I hope that we can make this session just as the rest of the day interactive and a 2-way conversation. So I won't talk very long. That way we can get to the fun part and take some questions from the audience there. But you know, I really appreciate the introduction and the look through. You know, in some ways, those books you described that I've written over the years, they help remind us that we live in an environment of media that is so vast, that means so many things to so many different people. And I think that's worth reflecting on and reminding ourselves, especially this morning, given that Ipsos Jordan Center polling, talking about what do people trust? Who do people trust? What is influential in people's lives? You know, for me, 15 years ago, writing about morning television, which is considered oftentimes softer news, but also lifestyle content and entertainment. But that's a connection point for millions of people, and it still is today. Somewhere else on that spectrum of content, Fox News and Newsmax and One America News and explicitly partisan pro-Trump outlets that exist as an alternative to the media and have been accepted by tens of millions of people as a source of reality, even though it's oftentimes not, or at least very, very incomplete when it comes to the coverage there. I guess I've gravitated to those different corners of the media environment while working inside 2 legacy mainstream institutions, the New York Times and now CNN. But I was really, it turns out, very lucky to be outside of CNN for a couple of years when Reliable Sources was canceled on television in 2022. And I had 2 years as a freelancer writing for outlets like Vanity Fair and The Atlantic, but also for magazines, for websites that are in some cases smaller or maybe not so mainstream. And I found that period after being on the inside at the New York Times and CNN to be exceedingly valuable, to think differently about how people consume media and how they decide what to trust. Since we're talking today about how the media can regain trust, it obviously starts with understanding where people are coming from to begin with, and what do they trust already. And I, certainly having spent a couple of years not on X as often, not on Blue Sky as much, not having to live in the news cycle minute by minute, not having to jump onto television immediately to react to some breaking news, not having to feel the pressure to file every day. I came away recognizing that the news environment, the news system in the US is really well structured for junkies. If you're a news junkie or a politics junkie like I am, there's no shortage of sources. There's an endless feed, an endless scroll of material and content. But if you're a more ordinary consumer, someone who is not inclined to care about the news, not inclined to care about politics, the news structure is not nearly as well situated. It can be much more confusing. It can be much harder to figure out what is going on, what is true, what is reliable. And my couple of years on the outside, in between my 2 stints at CNN, were a really valuable reminder of that. And it really it got me thinking about what products can be built, what services can be built, how can stories be written differently, how can journalists in newsrooms who are really good at writing for news junkies, how can we do a better job of writing for everybody else? How can we do a better job of reporting for everybody else? And I know that, now I'm back at CNN writing the Reliable Sources newsletter. I just shipped this morning's edition. And I know that a newsletter like that is written largely for people who are already following the events. Many of the stories I'm covering, I'm telling the story in the middle, as opposed to starting at the beginning. So I'm acknowledging here I'm sometimes part of the problem. But when we think about how to regain trust for a broader audience, I think we have to talk about starting stories at the beginning, starting with the basic facts of a conflict, for example, the history of the Islamic Republic, for example, when talking about the war in Iran, the reasons why the Strait of Hormuz is so significant, as opposed to the daily or hourly machinations. So that's something that I think about a lot now that I'm back at CNN, back covering the media, and then of course the other dominant topic on my mind, the dominant storyline I'm covering day to day, and the one that relates to public trust, is of course the Trump administration's war on the press and the attempts to delegitimize, to discredit, to demonize, I sometimes say destroy, the real reliable news sources in this country that are independent and are skeptical and are scrutinizing the administration. I know there'll be a lot of talk about that today. I won't spend too much time on it necessarily, but yeah, I can't help but bring it up when we start to talk about public trust, because for all of the media's many flaws, for all of our many weaknesses, the 40, 50-year right-wing campaign to delegitimize the press is also, of course, a crucial part of this story, and is a crucial reason why the media finds itself in the proverbial ditch along the side of the road. I'm borrowing from a colleague who has made this analogy that, we're like a tow truck driver, trying to pull that car out of the ditch. And I appreciate that image. It's not the prettiest image on this beautiful day, but I appreciate that image because it is that pulling you have to do, that towing, that force that's required, that inch by inch work, trying to get that car out of that proverbial ditch, the amount of power it takes to do so, the times where you might fail or the car might slide even further into the ditch, the times where you might have to try a different way. All of that kind of applies to this conversation about regaining public trust. And to me, it's about that inch by inch approach, the pulling, the work every day that's happening inch by inch to tell true stories and to convince the public that we are trustworthy. It's not all done in one action, right? It's certainly not all done in one day or 1 year. We all know that. But the inch by inch work is worthwhile. It is valuable. It does make a difference. And we can see that day in, day out in stories that do break through and that do make an impact in America and around the world. The most recent example is involving Democratic Congressman, now ex-Congressman, Eric Swalwell. I led my Reliable Sources newsletter with this topic today because it's been a week since the CNN and the Chronicle stories landed. And now there's been some great behind the scenes reporting about how the stories were sourced, how the stories were vetted, how those stories broke through. I cite that as an example because if you are a person who heard rumors about Swalwell and didn't know what to believe, if you're a person who has had a negative experience with someone in power and felt they would just get away with it and not be held accountable, if you're someone who believes the whole system is rotten and no one's trying to clean it up, then a story like that, a story by CNN about Swalwell, a story by the Chronicle about Swalwell, inch by inch, makes a difference and shows that there are still people trying and still people out there doing the digging and doing the reporting. And of course, there are so many examples like that. Swalwell happens to be in the news this week, but there are so many examples of that, including and especially as it relates to the Trump administration. Number one most read article on the Atlantic website today is from a whistleblower from the Kennedy Center. And the fact that there are those outlets, that there are those platforms for those whistleblowers is, of course, vital. So I think about it inch by inch. The other metaphor I think about it, other than the tow truck and the ditch, is a football field. The 100-yard line. I think about 1 yard at a time, one play at a time, one throw at a time, knowing that you're going to lose inches, you're going to lose yards sometimes, but you're also going to gain them. And that's how I think about kind of the daily struggle of journalism. That with every play, 1 yard at a time, trying to move the ball forward and trying to regain trust bit by bit. But I see it happening. And so I come at this from an optimistic point of view, and I would love to hear some more pessimistic takes from the audience there, from questions, from comments. But I, certainly wake up every day believing that work is worthwhile and that it is being done to a greater extent than some of the media critics will have you believe. We've obviously heard a lot in the last 15 months about the chilling effect the Trump administration wants to have on the American media. The attempts to quash and discourage reporting, the attempts to intimidate sources, the attempts to defund and shut down and silence newsrooms. It's been more than a full-time job chronicling the Trump administration's efforts to do so. And yet, in the face of all of that pressure, and the pressure is real, it seems to me that the American media is still standing up pretty darn straight, pretty darn tall. I'm fixing my posture even as I say it right now. Yes, there's been a chill in the air in the last 15 months, but it's the kind of chill in the air, the temperature might have changed 1 or 2 degrees. It's not the kind of change, in my view, as someone out there in the atmosphere every day, in the environment every day, that's required you to put on a coat. It's not the kind of change that's a permanent change to the climate. So the chilling effect is real, but the counter effect, the counter reaction is very real as well. And that's partly what I enjoy covering every day at CNN. I focus on stories of media outlets pushing back. For example, everybody writes a story when Trump sues a news outlet. It's a big story. It's a big deal. It's never happened before in our history that a sitting president has decided to go and sue news outlets because he doesn't like their coverage. But it's equally important, I would argue more important, to cover the times when he loses, when those lawsuits are rejected, as they have been by the New York Times lawsuit, now the Wall Street Journal lawsuit. It's really important to cover when these cases are thrown out. One of Trump's lawsuits against CNN he filed before he returned to office. It was rejected repeatedly by the courts. And I thought it was important to cover that at CNN because for all of the noise, for all of the pressure, for all of the attempts to silence real reporting in America, the reporting is getting done inch by inch, yard by yard. And I am relieved and I am heartened to see so many journalists on the beat, doing the job, doing the work, in spite of all of the pressure, in spite of all of the intimidation that is real and is happening right now. So that's why I'm an optimist. Maybe it's too optimistic. Tell me. Let's hear from the audience there in the room and see if we can get an interesting dialogue going here. Steve or somebody else there in the room. Somebody,
Yes.
is there a microphone? Yeah.
Yes, Brian, thank you. We will take some questions from the audience here, but I wanted first to get your reaction. You made reference to our Jordan Center Ipsos poll, which just was released about 20 minutes ago, which found that online platforms and personalities, especially those on the right of the political spectrum, have now overtaken television and traditional print outlets as regular news sources among people who voted, at least in the last presidential election here in the United States. And in that survey, the top names were not journalists, at least people we would not regard as journalists.
Right.
Joe Rogan, Greg Gutfeld, Sean Hannity, Ben Shapiro, Tucker Carlson. Some would say the message from the public is that the journalists have failed the public, that for whatever reason, people are now turning to these commentators, these opinion makers, not journalists. And that's also true if we look at the names on the left. Among those who voted for Kamala Harris, for example, it's Jimmy Kimmel, Stephen Colbert, Jon Stewart. I think all three of them would say, we're not journalists. What do you take away from those findings?
Right. I thought it was fascinating that Trump's name was at the top of the list of news influencers on the right.
If you include politicians, correct?
Yes, if you include politicians. But you should include politicians in one cut of this, because you need to acknowledge the entire information environment. And the notion that Trump himself is viewed as the key information source is so revealing about the cult of personality that exists, about the distrust of every institution, including Fox News and right-wing institutions that exists within MAGA America. I always want to keep in mind in these conversations that the Trump base is I was use the word minority. It's not in a disparaging way, but it's maybe a third of the country, probably less, because there are some people who respond in polls supporting Trump who do not at all identify as MAGA or as part of his movement. They support Trump part because they hate Democrats or because of other reasons. So recognizing that we're talking about maybe a third of the country's media consumption or less, it is really notable that, Rogan's name comes up at the top, Gutfeld's name comes up at the top. But I view all of them as primarily entertainers. Yes, they are expressing opinions. Yes, they are analyzing the news in some cases, but they're primarily entertainment products. Gutfeld literally hosts a late night comedy show, right? And Rogan's bringing on all sorts of figures and having fun with them. Yes, he has in-depth conversations, but he's entertaining. He's fun to listen to. And so I don't think it's realistic to expect that we can compete in the journalism realm with those entertainers. If I'm standing outside a circus, trying to put on a show or trying to give a lecture, I'm not going to get a crowd compared to the circus. And that's okay. Right. That's real. Let's be realistic about it. When it comes to figures like Sean Hannity as well, because he's high on your list as well from this poll. Having written 2 books about Fox News, I always say what Roger Ailes used to say: hit mute on the TV, just watch the screen. Don't listen to what he's saying. Just watch it. It's very well produced, very slick. It's very entertaining. It's very visual. Fox knows how to put on an entertaining product. And so I go back to that word entertainment when we think about the folks on the top of the list. But it's nonetheless a big deal and a big challenge to journalism, that it is entertainers and influencers and personalities that are oftentimes the ones that are identified as trusted. But aren't they partly being identified as trusted, Steve, just because they're big celebrities? Doesn't it also speak to the celebrity culture in American media? Because that's true on the left as well, right? When people name Jon Stewart and Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert, They are naming celebrities that they identify with and that they enjoy. And what I think all these figures have in common, and something that, newsrooms can learn from, because again, like obviously Kimmel's not part of a newsroom. Greg Gutfeld's not really part of a newsroom. He technically works for Fox News, but he's a comedian doing a comedy show. What we can learn from them is that they're all engaging in meaning making of one form or another. They are taking this smorgasbord of information, this buffet of news, and they are trying to make meaning out of it, or in some cases, just make fun of it. And that is, so valuable, so important. And I think an area where, I don't want to say old fashioned, but old line newsrooms have not spent as much time. I think there's a big wide open space between news and opinion that is making meaning of the news. You can call it analysis, call it perspective, lots of names for what it is. But that's a big wide open space where I would like to see the NBCs and the Washington Post of the world invest more in. We know the Post is focused, Bezos is focused on Washington Post opinion. But some of the best people that have left the Post are the ones that were doing analysis, that were explaining why the news mattered, were making meaning of the world. And, I'm not here to argue that any of them could become as famous as Jimmy Kimmel, but there's a real value in that space that I think is in between the just the facts reporting and the here's what I think should happen opinion.
Okay, I'm going to do the Oprah thing now and go out in the audience with a microphone, although there are no prizes under your seats. I'm sorry about that. But we do have pens on the table, right? Who would like to fire something at Brian here? Okay, we're going to, actually, if you could introduce yourself and then the floor is yours.
Hey, Brian, Jeff Trimble. I'm a recovering journalist and longtime colleague of Steve Herman. I want to ask you to react a little bit to AI and the role of AI in perhaps lessening public trust by contributing to this incredible amount of noise that's around us. First, do you agree with that? And then second, I'd like to put out a proposal that I hope everybody finds radical, but I'd be interested in your reaction. And that would be to include AI in the list of types of speech that would not have First Amendment protection. So in other words, the First Amendment already, there are 9 categories or so of speech that do not have First Amendment protection. You can do them, but you can't rely on First Amendment to protect against action against you. So I'm positing the idea that the only speech that would have guaranteed protection under the First Amendment would be speech generated by real humans, and nothing else would have First Amendment protection. Curious as to your reaction to that.
How difficult does that get when so much of what's out there is a mix of both?
Yeah, very difficult. That's why I'm asking you.
Well, you're making me wonder, what will the first big legal case be? What will be the first Supreme Court case be about defamation by AI, right? And maybe I'm surprised that we haven't already seen one of those. But that would be, that would get squarely to your point. I appreciate your framing about AI and how it contributes to the noise and makes people even more confused about what is real, because what is real is where that's what I always come back to as a starting point here. Most people still, despite the partisan divides and, cult-like behavior that we're seeing in politics today, most people still just want to know what is true. They do want to know what is real. They want news outlets to help them differentiate between what is real and not. And so because we're being overwhelmed by AI slop, and because AI is making it harder to know the difference, that certainly raises the importance and the value of our brands, of our news outlets. So I hope that in 10 years, we will look back on this chapter of technology as a chapter that enhanced the importance of news outlets and gave us more purpose. It gave us more reason for being. But in order to have that be the story 10 years from now, we have to live up to it and plainly debunk what is nonsense out there. and plainly tell people what is real and what is not. And of course, we can only do that to the extent that people trust us in the first place. But I'm an optimist on trust, because when severe weather breaks out, when there's something terrible happening in your town or something beautiful happening in your town, people do still rely on brands that have been around for a long time to tell them that it's legit or not. You know, I see it in the ratings charts at CNN. You can see it in the traffic data at the New York Times or at local news outlets, that those spikes that happen when news breaks, people are coming oftentimes because they've heard something happen, but they want it verified. And so that verification layer in an AI environment, my head is kind of spinning with opportunities for news brands about how to capture that and how to take advantage of that. At the same time, you know, news outlets spend a lot of money and a lot of resources on work right now that could and should be done by AI, or should be started by AI, meaning we should have databases full of every word the president's ever said, and be able to cross-reference those. We should be able to be pushing out transcripts and all the rest. And it's surprising how little of that is still happening, I think, from major newsrooms, given that we're able to take in such a volume of content and information now and provide that raw material to the public. I think that's another, you know, answer to this topic about regaining public trust, showing that we are almost like a library resource. You know, because if I think about our newsrooms in the U.S., let's just take I'll just take my personal example. I am very lucky. I'm very blessed as a journalist to have access to all these subscription news sites and closed captioning database for television. So I can go and find what was said on TV yesterday. I'm able to rewind and go back and watch that segment. I'm able to find what was said here or there. I do have that database with everything Trump has ever said. I have all these resources at my disposal that the public has a much harder time finding, and the public has a much harder time accessing. And it would be a great public service, right, for us to make the tools we use in our jobs more accessible to everybody else. And so when I think about AI, I think about those opportunities, even though the amount of noise is overwhelming, and the role of us as a verification layer is crucial.
Brian, the concerns about AI are addressed in the Oxford Declaration, which many in this room have been putting together.
Yeah.
And for those who are joining us remotely or in the room, you can go to newslab.org and check out that declaration, and we welcome your feedback on that. Next question. Okay, I will go here and then over there. The floor is yours. Please introduce yourself.
Hey, Brian. I'm Wes Muller. I'm at the Louisiana Illuminator. It's a nonprofit newsroom. I read your book, by the way. And my question is, did you see any data to suggest Fox News took a hit with public trust following those revelations with Dominion? And if not, what does it say about why the public trusts media outlets?
Right. The short answer is no. There's not evidence that Fox suffered through the revelations in the legal system. Fox only suffered insofar as its insurance policy had to pay out, a huge payment to Dominion. And there is still an ongoing case with Smartmatic. And there have been some other settlements by Fox that were smaller dollar amounts, but still painful. But to the extent that it suffered in the court of public opinion, non-Fox viewers had a lower impression of Fox. There was so much criticism from the middle and from the left, but not from the right. And I actually think if you're a Fox News executive, your bigger concern the last few years has been about pissing off the far right that believes 2020 was rigged and that believes Trump is telling the truth when he lies about the 2020 election. that was the bigger danger for the Fox executive crowd, was alienating the far right. And so what does that say about our environment? I think it speaks to the role of the media as a providing a sermon, trying to tell people that they're right and that what they feel is right, trying to provide affirmation as opposed to information. And we know that happens on the left as well. But I would argue that it's pretty, it's more pervasive and more damaging on the right and this moment in time, given that Trump is in power and given what Trump is doing with that power. But certainly it happens on the left. We all know it. We see the amen choirs and chorus that are out there. It's unique though on the right because, well, for many reasons. One is that it is true that many American conservatives have not seen themselves represented in the press for generations, have not believed that their America was represented and shown on the evening news, et cetera. And I don't want to discount how real those perceptions are or how real that is. All that said, though, when you're in an environment where the president weaponizes that for his own gain, the press has to speak out against it and call it out and describe what he's doing. So I think that the Dominion case and now the Smartmatic case, these cases against the big lie in 2020 have been valuable because they pushed out that evidence into the public domain. They provided this raw material. Maybe around the edges, some Fox viewers took it to heart and considered that. And I'm of the view, because maybe this is too optimistic. I think in 10 or 20 years, we'll all be able to look back on the Trump chapter a little more clearly. And a lot of people who today might claim an election was rigged will be a lot more honest with themselves, down the road. I suppose the words "this too shall pass" come to my mind, believing that, in the fullness of time, people will be more honest with themselves about what we've lived through. And in the meantime, day by day, let's chronicle it. And that's what journalists are doing. And I think really, really well. I think this is what gets underappreciated in Trump 2.0, amid all the pressure, amid the defunding of PBS, amid the attack against VOA, against all of the what Trump would call wins that are losses for the public. Like, the work is still being done to an extraordinary degree. And it's clearly getting through, because most Americans in polls do know the truth about what is going on and do recognize and do have real concerns about the administration. So, I look at that and I take a glass half full approach to our present moment, because I don't want all that great work, all those investigative stories, all those really challenging assignments to go unnoticed, right? CBS is trying to buy CNN and the rest of WBD right now. The Paramount deal is controversial for lots of reasons. There are certainly questionable moves that Paramount has made to appeal to the Trump administration. But if I were to make a list of all the big scoops published by CBS that were not Trump friendly, that were challenging to the administration, that were critical of the administration, that were problematic for the administration, that'd be a long list. I could finish the rest of the hour going through that list of CBS News stories about Trump. So I try to keep that in mind when I'm covering, let's say, the controversies at Paramount, when I'm covering examples of media companies currying favor with the administration. Because there's a long list of issues. There's also a long list of counterarguments that speak to the strength of the American media today. Sorry, took a little bit of a tangent there. Sorry.
Our next question comes from another one of our local news panelists that we'll be hearing from later today. Andre.
Thanks for that introduction, Steve. My name is Andre Nada. I'm the executive editor of Birmingham Watch in Birmingham, Alabama. And to that point, could you kind of expand? Could you kind of into it a couple times before? The impact of the focus on national media outlets makes it really hard for local news outlets to be able to go ahead and hold feet to the fire on local officials and the needs of people living in neighborhoods. And I feel like sometimes we spend so much time focusing on the big picture of Trump 2.0 that we don't show the impact where it matters and how it fits in people's lives. So
Yeah.
how,
Give us a good example from Birmingham. What's a recent one for you?
well, currently we actually just ran a story this morning about, or reran a story about our water utility board. It's been for better part of 20 years, but in the last 18 months, it's had a state takeover, and they just went ahead and eliminated the entire fleet management and turned it into a contract job. And it's a big story considering it's the largest water supply organizer for the state of Alabama. But you wouldn't know that based upon what's being talked about and at the national level. And you have those types of stories happening throughout the Southeast. So how do you go ahead and rectify the fact that there are people suffering through things in the South that need to get that information, but that information can get drowned out at times by national?
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. But that example of that story you republished today, isn't that a prime example of the inch by inch work of rebuilding trust? That the readers, the people who engage with that report, they know it in their bones, or they know it in their water pipes to be true. They know it to be a real issue, and hopefully they relate more positively to the local outlet as a result. You know, I suppose where I take the question is toward the direction of local and national collaboration, because, you know, we've seen so many of these beneficial collaborations in recent years where national and international brands can amplify the local work. And in a funny way, the Swalwell, not funny, but in a recent way, the Swalwell reporting is actually a bit like that. Even though the Chronicle and CNN were competing, you had a local brand pursuing a story at the same time. And, you know, the editor of the Chronicle had a piece out yesterday saying having that pressure, that competition from another outlet strengthened both of them. I thought that was a really interesting take on it, as they weren't collaborating, they were competing, but the national coverage helped the local coverage and vice versa. And because you had two teams both pursuing it and almost checking each other's work, both finding the same findings. I thought that was interesting. But yeah, to me, it's that point about collaboration and finding, are there ways for national outlets to uplift the local work as opposed to just swoop in, copy it, repeat it, regurgitate it for a national audience. And I think hopefully local journalists can help put the right kind of pressure on the nationals to do that and to do it in a responsible way as opposed to an irresponsible way.
Andrea, are the water pipes in Birmingham connected to the ones in Jackson, Mississippi? It's an inside joke. Let me go here. Okay.
I'm a 101-year-old Missouri, Mississippi Republican. My son-in-law, Jack Cohen, is a New York City Democrat, and I want you to meet him.
Okay, from the 101-year-old Republican father to the much younger New York City Democrat. You are Jack Cohen.
Attorney in New York. Good morning, Brian. First of all, my 101-year-old father-in-law, Republican, is my idol. And look him up sometime, Windsor Morrison. You'll find out why. But you touched on something at the beginning of your conversation about the history of the Islamic Republic. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, I watched a documentary on PBS that I hadn't seen at the time, bringing up the whole history of the Islamic Republic, the CIA coup in 1953, the Shah, etc. These stories, I think, are lost on most modern news audiences. How can CNN and other news outlets incorporate some of this historical perspective into their daily news coverage to teach their audience something about facts, not just what Democrats say about it, Republicans, left, right, but what are the facts? What's the background, and how does this affect what's going on today? Thank you.
Right. I'm, by the way, I'm reading about Windsor from the Ozark County Times. This is the story you might have mentioned. You just Google, you Google him, you'll find him. You know, here is what you're saying about the story behind the story, the deeper story, the history, the context. it makes me think about how our media environments changed and how smartphones have changed everything about how we engage in media. Because, for 40 years, CNN was one main thing, which was a linear stream of live news. Banner on the bottom of the screen, heads talking up top. It's a version of CNN that I love. I've got a studio in my basement. I can pop up in 2 minutes notice and I can be live around the world. There's an incredible power and responsibility that comes from that live linear feed. But the great thing about the last 5, 10, 15 years is that now there's a version of CNN that's more popular, that is a homepage, that is a website, that is an app. And I think that's where there's the potential for what you're describing. And that's where I see some of that work being done. And not just at CNN, right? There's a version of this at the New York Times and at NBC and at Reuters and at the LA Times and all the rest. Because we've moved from a one size fits all linear model of news or a one paper a day on the front stoop version of news, we've moved into an app-based, web-based, vertical video-based model that does actually allow for more depth and context, where there's more room for that vertical video explainer of the history, where there's more room for that in-depth piece that takes you through the 40 years of history, that shows you an interactive timeline. What I'm saying is that we have all these tools now at our disposal to provide that. We have to hopefully actually meet that challenge and produce that work. But, I've seen, for example, at CNN with our new subscription service on the app, we have something called CNN Explainers, long form pieces that explain the Strait of Hormuz, for example. Whether those are getting millions of views, whether those are getting the audience to come along for the ride, I don't know. And that's actually that would be my concern, is not so much whether news outlets are producing the historical context and the explainers, but whether we're doing a good enough job promoting and marketing those and getting those to people. And then ultimately whether people really want them, right? And how big is the audience for that more in-depth work? I don't know. But when I talked to my babysitter here in New Jersey, who bailed on me and made it harder for me to get to Mississippi, when I talked to her about her news environment, her news habits, she is so plugged out of the news, right? So unaware of the news. She barely knew about the war, right? She mostly knew about the war through the gas prices. But rather than me look down on her for that, rather than me be frustrated that, it's only the rise of gas prices that gets her concerned about Iran, I got to view that as an opportunity. I've got to view that as an opportunity. How do I turn her into a CNN consumer? What can CNN make that's going to be more appealing to a 25-year-old who doesn't know the first thing about the news and usually doesn't want to know, right? I view her news avoidance almost as like a protective shell. Like she's protecting herself against the nastiness in politics and against the ugliness of the news environment. But okay, that's good to know. What can we do to get through to her? What can we produce differently that helps her know why gas prices are so high, and frankly, helps her know who to blame, and helps her know what might change and all of that. So, I like that reframe when I hear from people who are news avoiders, who are not plugged in, who don't know the first thing about the history. What can we make? What can we produce to help them along?
We've got time for one more question for Brian. I'm going to get my exercise and walk.
If anybody knows a great babysitter in central New Jersey, I'm on the hunt for one. So I'm taking referrals.
We're making the long walk.
No problem. Introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm David Cruz, just a local yokel. Brian, thanks for being here. I'd love to get your assessment of what's going on with Pete Hegseth, his vicious rhetoric, not only towards Iran, which is maybe somewhat understandable in his position, but his vicious rhetoric towards the news media, assessing the news media as an equal enemy as Iran is in some fashion.
Yeah. Yesterday was strange. It was hard to watch. It was upsetting. As a Christian, I found it deeply offensive. And as a journalist, I found it odd because Hegseth, for those who didn't see, he likened the press to the Pharisees, but he also complained that the U.S. press is not doing enough to cover military successes, that we're not telling the stories of the U.S. military and its victories in Iran. And to that, I would make the argument, and I did on CNN, and I hope folks in the Pentagon heard me, the Pentagon can do so much more to open up access, to help us tell those stories, to provide videos from the war zone, to make service members available for interviews. Every network in this country would love to interview the airmen who were behind enemy lines, who were rescued. That would be the most compelling television interview in America today and tomorrow. But they're not being provided for interviews. You know, we're not getting the access that we want and we need and the public deserves. So Hegseth was railing against the media, acting like we're not doing our jobs, but we, you know, journalists want to tell those stories. And by the way, I think journalists have tell those stories. But we want to tell those stories. Instead, he's trying to push the press out. He's trying to block reporters from the Pentagon. So why is he doing that? And why is he using the holy war rhetoric? Well, when it comes to the holy war rhetoric, I think it reflects his own religious background. I think he's trying to appeal to the president. You know, I think every time he gets up in front of that podium and attacks the press, he's doing what he thinks the president wants him to do, what he thinks will appeal to the president, what he thinks will appeal to his base in the future. You know, Hegseth is thinking about, you know, what job he'll have 3 or 5 years from now. I think it's deeply disingenuous and dishonest. But here's the most important point. Most people see through it, right? Hegseth got up there yesterday, said the press is unpatriotic. Most Americans know that's hogwash. Like, most Americans are not buying what he's selling. I think it's so interesting and so important to look at the polling about Trump, about the war, about Hegseth, that most Americans like see right through the garbage. When Trump lies about the press, yes, people have concerns about the news media and its credibility. Yes, they are right to be skeptical of the work we do. We should earn their trust every day. But Americans also reject his lies about the press. And, you know, there is an alternative timeline in America in 2026 where 10 years of media bashing could result in a very different dynamic in this country. Now, I say that knowing that we are going through a version of democratic backsliding. I say that with deep concerns about the autocratic streak we've seen in Trump. But I recognize that most Americans have rejected it and don't want it and don't like it. And so I say all that because Hegseth will continue to try. You know, yes, he will continue to beat up on the press. He will continue to attack his old colleagues at Fox News. He will continue to lie about the press being unpatriotic. But I take heart in the fact that most people see through it. And there's another optimistic take for me to end on, Steve.